Good morning, everyone, and happy Friday to you. I hope that you're having a great end to the week. I'm sorry that we can't be together in class today, but I still hope we can walk through the PowerPoint about our introduction to skeletal muscle and give you a chance to practice some content today, even though we're not together. As a quick reminder, we will walk through the PowerPoint and the clicker questions are still within the slides. However, you clearly will not be able to interact with the questions as you would normally in class. All of the clicker questions are available in a short Canvas quiz in the skeletal muscle module. In order to get clicker points for Friday today, all you have to do is complete that quiz and submit it by 11:59 p.m. today. So 11:59 p.m. on Friday will get you access to the points for your clicker. So again, our goal today will be to go through our first conversation about skeletal muscle. So I'm going to pull up that content and we're going to work through that through this video. All right, so to start off with our conversation, I would like to first remind you about what we talked about the last couple days in class. So that has been information about the peripheral nervous system and its organization. So in this slide, we can see a comparison of the two different divisions of our motor divisions, the two different functional divisions. So on your left, you'll see what is known as the somatic division, somatic. And on your right is the visceral. And again, both of these are the motor divisions. So on your left with the somatic, how did I know this was somatic? Well, number one, I can look at the target and see that the target is skeletal muscle. The term somatic does refer to our voluntary muscle. On the visceral side, we can look at the targets and see that we have things like smooth muscle, we have things like glands, cardiac tissue. So a lot of the tissues that are involuntary, and of course visceral refers to organ, so these will make sense. Some of you might have noticed here that adipocytes are actually listed, so you may not realize that the nervous system can help regulate what goes on our fat tissue, and that is actually important regulation for our metabolism, as an interesting side note. So what we're going to be focusing on over the next few weeks or few lectures is going to be our somatic motor division. So highlighted here on the left, we're going to be focusing on how voluntary muscle regulation happens. And I do want to remind everyone that we are looking at just the motor divisions in this slide. So just to highlight and make it a little bit larger, here what I'm drawing is the soma of our interneuron with the axon traveling down to the spinal cord, ending here at a synapse. And that neuron is synapsing with the efferent neuron, also known as the motor neuron, to the target tissue and forming synapses with the individual skeletal muscle cells. So you'll notice that there is no sensory input shown on this image. Right? And we can mention later on what the sensory might look like. But for right now, we're really going to be focusing in on what's happening here where the nervous system is communicating with our skeletal muscle. So I just wanted to clarify that and what we're seeing in this image. So before we can talk more about those details, we have a few major questions we'll be addressing. So the first thing that we're going to be looking at, which is what today is about, is understanding the general characteristics of muscle and what types of characteristics muscle has. So this is what we're really going to be focusing on here. I should delete here cardiac muscles next. That's if you take Bio 163. We'll be talking about that next semester. Now, in addition to understanding what type of muscle exists and their characteristics, we are then going to focus on our skeletal muscle. We're going to understand the cellular structure of it. We're going to understand the communication between neurons and the skeletal muscle tissue. And that interaction will ultimately lead to a muscle contraction. And finally, we're going to think about how do we regulate these contractions? So how do we have control over our muscles? So that's where we're going to be going with our unit about skeletal muscle. So we'll start here with some of the general properties of muscles. So these are just some of the vocab words you'll need to know. Hopefully you'll recognize the term excitability. That is something we've talked about in the past. So an excitable tissue just has the ability to respond to external stimuli. In this case, the external stimuli will be chemicals that will be released from motor neurons. So what we're talking about here are neurotransmitters. Right. So, oops, undo that. Transmitters. So muscle tissue has the ability to be excited by neurotransmitters. So that's the excitability part. Now, in addition to being excitable, these muscle cells have the ability to conduct the excitement away from a starting point. So if we think about how long some muscles might be, let's think of our bicep, for example. A signal that starts at one end of the bicep will have to travel all the way to the other on a long muscle cell. So we have to have the ability to propagate that signal from one point to another. The final three characteristics kind of go together. So muscle cells have the ability to contract. They have the ability to be extensible. Oops, that should be 2. And then they have the ability to be elastic. So number 1, to contract, that means just to shorten and create force, which we're used to thinking about with muscles. Number 2 and 3 kind of are opposite of each other. The muscle must be able to stretch without being damaged, and then after stretching, return to its original size. So those kind of go hand in hand. If you think about the number of times our muscles contract, if each time they became damaged, it would be a lot of problems resulting from that. So those are our general characteristics. Next here, I have a clicker question for you to think about. So I'll give you a few minutes to look over that and give it a thought. So hopefully you can jot down that answer and then go take the Canvas assessment for the clicker questions. So moving on, the pre-week assignment this week focused on the different types of muscle tissue that exist in our body. And that's going to be our skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So I'd like to walk through some of the characteristics of these different types of muscle. So when we talk about skeletal muscle, we immediately want to think about it as our voluntary muscle. This is the muscle we have control over contracting. One of the things that we can note about skeletal muscle is its shape. So up here in the drawing, we have a representation of a single muscle cell. All right, we actually don't see the beginning or the end. We just see that it's very long and cylindrical. And that's an important characteristic. So skeletal muscle cells can be very long. And again, they're cylindrical in shape. Cylindrical. And if we look inside of the muscle cell in this cartoon here, you'll notice that there are these line patterns. I'll highlight a few of those. But these line patterns are called striations. These striations are actually reflecting the organization of proteins inside of the muscle cell. When we look at it through a microscope, they look like stripes, so striations. We'll actually be talking about the organization of the protein next week. In addition, hopefully you'll notice there's several of these purple looking structures. These are the nuclei. So skeletal muscles are actually multinucleate. They can have many, many nuclei. This is because during development, skeletal muscles actually fuse from many smaller cells to make one very long cylindrical cell. And in skeletal muscle cells, we look at the points of attachment, and they typically attach to bone or a structure called fascia, which is an example of connective tissue. So we'll see some examples of that in a moment. So looking at bone to muscle connections, there are several we'll mention here. The first one is the most common that you typically associate when muscles are attached to bone, and this is indirect. And when we think of indirect, what we want to think about is that the muscle tissue does not directly enter the bone. There is something in between the two, and the thing that's in between is that there is a tendon. Shown here. So what is a tendon? Well, a tendon is, as we talked about in class, dense, regular connective tissue. Right? So we said dense, regular connective tissue. And it is actually part of the connective tissue of muscle called the epimysium. We're going to see this in a moment, so don't worry too much about that, but this is the term for the outer coating of a muscle. So we look at indirect connections. There's a tendon between the belly of the muscle here and its insertion point into bone, which we see kind of here and here in this picture. This again is the most common type of connection that we see, and a great example would be our biceps again, that we can very easily imagine. Now, the next type of connection, if this is indirect, the next type we have is what we call direct. And this is also oftentimes referred to as a fleshy connection. So what's different about this connection is that there is not a tendon involved. So it looks like the muscle is directly emerging and directly connecting to the bone. So again, the big difference here is that we do not easily observe a tendon. So no tendon. So again, it appears as though the muscle is directly entering and exiting from the bone. The best example we see of this in our body, so there's two pictures here in our PowerPoint slide, are the intercostal muscles, which are the muscles that are between our ribs. So as you can see, there's not really a tendon between the rib bones, just muscle. So providing that direct connection rather than having a tendon in between. Our final connection I want to mention is that oftentimes muscle doesn't connect to bone, but connects to other connective tissue. And this is what we call fascia. So fascia is just another word for connective tissue that we see in our body. Right, so the fascia term right here. And the anatomical term we use for this fascia is called an aponeurosis. Aponeurosis right here. And this structure is actually quite similar to a tendon, so it is dense, regular, connective tissue. So dense, regular connective tissue. But instead of being a very tight, narrow band connecting to the bone, fascia, and aponeurosis in this example, tends to be more broad and more flat. Right? And again, we're not connecting to a bone here. This is actually providing the connection for the muscle. So you can see two examples here. In the palm of our hand, we have this broad, flat connective tissue that many of the muscles of our forearm attach to. And then also in the abdominal area. So I have a nice picture of this on the next slide. So while in the previous two examples, muscles attached to bone to create motion, in this example, muscles attaching to connective tissue to actually create motion. So looking a bit closer at the abdominal muscles, if you're in lab, you'll learn about these different layers, but I will mention them here in lecture as well. So we do have multiple layers making up our abdominal muscles. And what I wanted to show you in this example, which I'll highlight here in red, is where we see the aponeurosi here and here that the muscles connect to. And if you look closely at the fiber direction of our muscles, The first example is the transverse abdominis, which goes around our body like a belt. When it contracts, it kind of compresses all the entire organs. And it's pulling on the aponeurosis here to create that tension of compression. In our second layer, we have the rectus abdominis. Right? These are the muscles we think of with our six-pack. Right? So we can highlight that here. Oops, forgot the number 5. These are examples of bony connections. So here we're making it connections with the bone. And then finally, in layer 3, we see the outermost layer of our muscle, our oblique muscles, which, as you can imagine, we pull on the center connective tissue to create the side-to-side bending of the trunk. So in this example, we see both fascia and bone involved with our abdominal muscles. So even though our focus is on skeletal muscle, I want to mention briefly cardiac and smooth, just so you have an idea of what we're comparing to. So cardiac and smooth are both examples of involuntary muscle. So again, it's part of our visceral division. We cannot control contraction of either of these. When we look at cardiac muscle, hopefully you'll see some differences just from the cartoon representation. But we are seeing in cardiac muscle that it is going to be branched. So if we look at the overall shape, before we mentioned skeletal muscle long and cylindrical, cardiac muscle tends to be short and have many branches. Right? So that's an important characteristic. So we'll just write down here, short with branches. One of the things you will notice is that the cardiac muscle has the same striation pattern. So we see the same stripes occurring, and that's because the proteins that cause contraction are the same within skeletal and cardiac tissue. That's important to note. Because these cells are smaller, shorter than skeletal muscle, they are mononucleate. So they typically have one nucleus. I think in the pre-week video, they mentioned it may be binucleate, possibly having 2, but in most cases, it's 1 nucleus. And another difference is that cardiac tissue is autorhythmic, so it can self-regulate contraction, which is an important difference. If we switch over to smooth muscle, we see quite a few differences here. Again, smooth muscle is an example of our involuntary muscle. We can't control it. This is going to be muscle that we typically see in all other organs besides the heart. I don't think I actually mentioned that cardiac tissue makes up the heart, but that is the case. Cardiac tissue is our heart tissue. Smooth muscle we see mostly in hair follicles and all the walls of our hollow organs. So this could include things like our blood vessels, would be one example. Another example could be our GI tract. So our stomach, our small intestines, all those hollow organs in our body. You'll notice in the cartoon representation that these take on kind of a wispy shape. Right. So they tend to be short, small, and another big difference is that they do not have the same striping or striation pattern. So these are non-striated. And this is important because it's telling us that the way smooth muscle cells contract is very different from the way we see contraction in skeletal and cardiac muscle. So point of comparison there. So now we've seen some cartoon representation of these muscles. I'll give you a chance here to look at 3 microscopic images. And I'll give you a few minutes to look at these. And for each one, try to identify the different characteristics you're noticing that can help you identify which is skeletal, which is cardiac, and which is smooth. So again, you can go to the Canvas assessment to answer that question for your credit. So a little bit more information here now, zooming into our skeletal muscle. So again, looking at some of the general characteristics associated with skeletal muscle specifically. This is just some vocab that we have to get through. So unfortunately, it's probably not very exciting and pretty difficult to make exciting, but it is important vocab we need to discuss the skeletal muscle. So what we can talk about here is the hierarchical arrangement of our muscle tissue. So when I say hierarchical, that just means from biggest to smallest, or we could reverse it and look from smallest to biggest. The way it is organized in the slide is going to be from biggest to smallest. So we're looking at our structure from big to small. So from our biggest structure down to our smallest. So of course, our biggest structure and the first thing we'll look at is our muscle itself. So this is kind of a cutaway in this image. I'm highlighting it in red, but it's a bit hard to see, so maybe I'll try using a different color here. Right, so this is our muscle that I'm kind of outlining here. That is our biggest structure. And what we see in this image is a telescoping image where they've cut the muscle open so we can see what's going on inside the muscle. So inside the muscle, of course, we expect to see muscle cells. But those muscle cells are organized in a specific fashion. And they're organized into bundles that we call fascicles. So here I'm highlighting in blue several of the different fascicles that are shown here. So a fascicle is just a group of muscle cells. And I do want to mention that oftentimes in physiology textbooks, authors will interchange the term muscle cell for muscle fiber. So if you do see the term muscle fiber, it's actually referring to an individual cell. I think that is a little confusing. So I try to use the term muscle cell in my class and ignore muscle fiber, just because I think muscle cell is more descriptive based on what we're talking about. Now these muscle cells, grouped in fascicles, are actually themselves filled with proteins. So in this image, I just highlighted where we have a single muscle cell kind of expanding out from a fascicle. And if we were to look inside of that cell and get inside that cell, we'll see that the cell itself is filled with long bundles of proteins. And these long bundles of proteins are called myofibrils. So it's just an example of protein cables that span the whole entire length of the cell. And remember, these cells are very long and cylindrical. So they're packed full of this protein. And this protein is actually going to help us with contraction. So the protein itself is causing the contraction that we see in skeletal muscle. There are 3 different types of proteins within the myofibril, and these are called myofilaments. And we're going to be learning about these next week a lot, but these different types of proteins, in case you're wondering, are called myosin, actin, and elastin. So we're going to get a more in-depth examination of these proteins next week. And remember our discussion about the fact that these muscle cells look like they have stripes, they have striations. The reason we see these striations is because their proteins are organized in a very specific direction in a very specific structure called sarcomeres. Right? So this is how we organize the protein. And a sarcomere is a contractile unit of a muscle. So it is the organization of these proteins that basically help with contraction. And again, we'll talk much more in depth about this information next week. We're just introducing the terminology now. Right? So if we go from biggest to smallest, our journey is going to go muscle to fascicle, fascicle to muscle cells to myofibrils, and finally myofibrils to myofilaments, from biggest to smallest. Now within the cellular structure that we just mentioned, there is connective tissue. And this connective tissue is important to protect the muscle cells. And this protection mostly involves reducing friction as muscle cells and the muscle itself contracts and rubs against other tissues in the body, including bone, for example. And it also helps to create space for extracellular fluid. And this is a little interesting to think about, but when we talk about muscle contraction, we're going to be talking about movement of ions still, and these ions need to exist in extracellular fluid. So by creating space between the individual muscle cells, we now have fluid in the extracellular area with ions that can then exchange across the membrane. And that's really important. So we need to have some space for this extracellular fluid. So again, looking at the largest to smallest, biggest to smallest structures, we first start with the superficial fascia. This is actually the same as our hypodermis. If you remember talking about skin, this was the layer furthest away from the surface, so most interior. So this is the most interior of our skin. Oops. And it is kind of the connection point between our skin and our muscle. So it's filling in those spaces, the hypodermis. Directly on top of the muscle, we have a structure called the epimysium. So I mentioned that earlier in our conversation. And the epimysium is actually connective tissue that is continuous with the tendon. You can kind of draw that in there. The epimysium itself tends to be irregular, so dense, irregular tissue. Should include the word dense there. But as it makes its way towards the tendon, it becomes regular. So the tendon itself, again, is regular. It's still dense, regular. So we go from a more kind of random orientation. When we get to the tendon, everything tends to be very parallel in our connective tissue layers. Okay. Now, as we go into the interior of the muscle, the epimysium splits into our third layer, which is the connective tissue around each fascicle. And this is very similar to our structure within our nerves that we mentioned. And this is called our perimysium. So I'm over here highlighting that here. Peri, of course, meaning perimeter. So this is making the perimeter around the individual fascicles. So this helps hold the fascicles together and provide some protection there. And the final layer is called our endomysium. So our endomysium, which is between the individual cells. So again, here in this image, they're using the term fibers, but again, I prefer the term cells. So let me write that a bit neater. Cells here. And this is where, again, we see the importance of providing space for the extracellular fluid. Around each cell, there's a little bit of a buffer room where we can fill it with fluid. That fluid has a lot of the ions that we need to actually excite the muscle cells. So having these ions present is pretty critical. And the endomysium helps with that functionality. All right, so here we have a clicker question for you. I'll give you a second to look at that one. All right, please make sure to check in with that Canvas assignment to get your credit for your clicker questions. And here I just included, I like to show histological examples so we can see what the actual tissue looks like. So here we have a section through a muscle through a muscle where we can see the different types of connective tissue. Right, so we see the epimysium on the outermost portion here. All right, around the whole entire muscle. Each individual fascicle is going to be highlighted with this perimysium. And in this image, it is challenging to see the different fascicles. So I'd have to make sure to ask you on a test, try to more clearly define where these are, but you can kind of get a general idea. And then the endomysium, of course, I'll make that a slightly different color here. It's going to be the very thin layer just directly on top of the cells. And a comment here I wrote down at the bottom of the slide but these circles that you're seeing are actually the nuclei of the muscle cells that we are cutting through in this image, right? So that muscle cell is coming out towards you and going down into the paper, being long and cylindrical. In most cases, the skeletal muscle cells do actually span tendon to tendon, so they can be quite long. They start off in development as small cells, but as the fetus, as the child and adult grow, they do get longer and longer. Right? And there can be some overlap, but in general, they can be very long. So this brings us to our final slide here for your Friday fun with skeletal muscle. And just to mention, this will be helpful, especially if you're going to be taking lab, is to understand that our skeletal tissue can be organized in different shapes, which is important for functioning of the contractions. So the shape can help with the strength and the direction of the contractions. And the shape really is based on the organization of the fossicles, which are the bundles of our muscle cells. And oftentimes, sorry for the non-carnivores out there, but hopefully it doesn't gross anybody out, but we can think of the fossicles as the grain meat. So if we cut a steak and we cut with the grain, we're cutting in the same direction of the fossicles versus against it would be through the fossicles. So give you a second here. We have several different types of muscle shapes. These are the general shapes we see. And you can think about, even just using the name, hopefully you can come to some conclusion with what the structure looks like. Within the Canvas quiz, I do give you the answers and tell you a little bit more about each shape, so you can check that out. But that's going to really kind of end our conversation for today with our introduction to general muscle structure. So thank you for tuning in and putting up with me in my first attempt to make a video. I hope it wasn't too painful. And please do enjoy your Friday off and have a great weekend. We'll get together again next week to continue our conversation about skeletal muscle, starting to zoom in and looking at how does the cell get excited by the motor neuron associated with it, and how do we cause contraction. So take care, have a great weekend.